Okay, so good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining me tonight. So we're going to begin looking at what's known, generally called Pirkei Avot. Pirkei Avot means chapters of the fathers. It's sometimes called ethics of the fathers. I don't want to spend too much time on a preamble. I like to dive into the text fairly quickly, but I think I do need to give like a little background context what it is. So it is um, a tractate of the Mishnah. The Mishnah is the earliest rabbinic legal text. It's codified scholarly consensus roughly around the year 200 of the Common Era. And in Yavne, which is a town near Tel Aviv on the coast, although it was not a town near Tel Aviv at the time because Tel Aviv did not exist. And it was codified under the leadership of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. And there was a taboo, not just a taboo, there was a prohibition against writing down what's known as the oral law. But eventually the Roman persecutions became so extreme that there was a real fear that everybody who knew the oral law could be killed. And so it was an emergency measure to write it down. So if you think that using Zoom on Shabbos or counting a minyan on Zoom was the first time in Jewish history that there was an emergency measure that overrode everything that had existed before, it's not the case. It's happened very many times. And its attempt, because if I want to know what are all the laws of Shabbat, right? Well, first of all, in the Torah, they're not all gathered in one place, right? They're all over the place. And of course, if you assumed that actual Jewish practice could be determined by what you would find in the Torah, you would be very misinformed, right? We all know that. But so there was an attempt to gather and codify practice as it existed then. Okay, so it was written down around or codified around the year 200 of the Common Era. The material there is often much, much older, as we'll see. And there are 6 orders, and within each order, there are a number of tractates. So let me quickly sort of give you what the orders are, okay? First order is Zra'im, which literally means seeds, but this deals with the laws of agriculture. Okay, although, for example, I mean, there are things that we might not think of as dealing with agriculture. For example, Masechet Brachot. Brachot word means blessings. That is all the blessings and prayers, and it focuses on the Shema and the Amidah. That's in Zra'im. I mean, I guess there's a certain logic to it because we make blessings over fruits and vegetables and so on. Second order is Moed, holidays, deals with the laws of all the holidays. The third is called Seder Nashim. Nashim literally means women, but it deals with family law. The fourth order is Nizikin, which means damages, and it deals with civil law. Okay, it deals with, well, civil law because there was no, criminal law. I mean, no ability. I mean, they were living under Roman occupation. Um, so the Jews had no ability to have an independent system of criminal law. Um, the fifth is Kodashim, which deals with the laws of sacrifices, although it must be noted that at the time um, order Kodashim was codified, there hadn't been sacrifices for 130 years. Okay, so this is all very theoretical material. And then the last one is Toharot, which means purity. So it deals with, I mean, a lot even then was not so actually relevant because the temple didn't stand. So all of the ritual purity laws surrounding the temple also didn't stand, but there's still the question of nida, of menstrual impurity, the laws of the mikveh, and so on and so forth. So, of those, if you don't already know, um, where do you think? Well, I shouldn't ask you that question. I'll just tell you. So, Pirkei Avot, or more properly, Masechet Avot. Masechet means tractate. Masechet Avot falls into the order of nizikin, of damages. Um, and what's unique about Masechet Avot is it is the only tractate that's not, it doesn't contain laws. It's not legal material. So then what is its role and why is it in Nizikin? Not 100% certain. I mean, they didn't leave, author's notes or, contemporaneous commentary, but um, many scholars speculate that the function of Masechet Avot originally was as a sort of guidebook orientation, manual exhortation for judges. Um, and some of what we'll see even tonight, depending on how far we get, makes sense that would be what its role was. Okay. But it's clearly like, all of rabbinic literature. I mean, there's an interesting phenomenon. It is written originally as professional literature, right? Just as like, an average person like me is not going to pick up a law journal and read it, right? I mean, I have read law journal articles on occasion, but they're not really intended for me. And they assume knowledge that I often do not possess, right? All the more so if I were to attempt to read a medical journal article. And I would imagine that if I were to read a journal article in a journal for accountants, like all the more so would I not understand any of it, right? It's professional literature, and pretty much every Jewish texts, every Jewish legal text was originally intended as professional literature. And then it came to be studied more broadly, which is why you have the phenomenon of commentaries. Okay, I am actually shockingly at this point going to shut up. If there are any questions or comments, either on what I've said or beyond on Mishnah, Pirkei Avot, whatever, go ahead. Okay, great. Everything that I said was crystal clear. So we'll start looking at the text. Okay, so the first text, the first Mishnah, that's right. So now this is a little confusing, right? The overall work is called the Mishnah, and then each little, like, right, in the Bible you have a book, a chapter, and a verse, right? So in the Mishnah you have an order, a tractate, and then what would be a verse in the Bible is called a Mishnah in the Mishnah. Okay, so when I first started studying Mishnah, I found that a little bit confusing. But so when I say the first Mishnah that we're going to look at, that's what I mean. The first little, pericope. So, all right. So what I'm going to do, because I think especially with this particular Mishnah, which is like absolutely, absolutely foundational. I'm going to read it in Hebrew, even though there's a translation here. I'm going to read it in Hebrew and translate it myself, although frankly, my translation is not all that different from Dr. Kolb's translation. Moshe kibel Torah misinai. Moses received the Torah at Sinai, or more literally from Sinai. The mem me means really from, not at. If it was at, it would say Moshe kibel Torah b'Sinai, but it says Moshe kibel Torah mi Sinai u'mesara liHoshua, and he transmitted it to Joshua, Vishua liskenim, and Joshua to the elders, meaning Joshua transmitted it to the elders, uskenim linviim, and the elders to the prophets, unviim misaruha lanshe knesset hagdola, and the prophets transmitted it to the men of the great assembly. Hem amru shlosha dvarim, they said three things. Havu mitunim baden, be patient in justice, or actually even matun could also be like moderate, be moderate in justice. V'ha'amidu talmidim harbe, raise up many disciples. Va'asu sayag la Torah, and make a fence for the Torah. Okay. Now, before I plunge, right, I've read it. Does that mean that we understand it? If you did, then my work here is done. But if you did also, like, you don't need me. So any questions or comments about what I just read before I plunge in to trying to explicate what this all means?
I was wondering what's meant by make a fence around the Torah.
Okay, so that's one question. What is meant by make a fence around the Torah? All right, I'm not going to answer it. I just want to get all the questions out there, or the comments out there.
Well, who were the men of the Great Assembly?
Who were the men of the Great Assembly, right? I mean, that's like sort of a obvious question, right? Have any of you heard of the men of the Great Assembly prior to this? All right. Anything else? All right, so I have a question, all right? Because, I mean, to me, this is deceptively simple, right? And, one of my real heroes, and certainly in an era like today, if I could bring Daniel Patrick Moynihan back to life, I would do so, right? But Moynihan once said, what we need is not more simplifiers. What we need is more complicators. And I think that's true. Everyone wants to make things simple. I don't want to make things simple. I want to make them complicated. Okay. So Moses received the Torah at Sinai. Very simple. What does that mean?
What does that mean? He was alone when he received it. I don't know if that's significant.
Right. He was alone when he received it, right? I mean, and if you did the theology class a few years ago, right, we spent a lot of time on what Moses received the Torah at Sinai actually means, right? Because the sort of orthodox dogma is that basically Moses was just, a stenographer, right? That God dictated the Torah and Moses wrote it down word for word. Okay. I don't want to get into that, right? I mean, I do not find that credible. If you do, fine. But that's not actually relevant for understanding this Mishnah, because what makes this both foundational but also complicated is, so Moses received the Torah at Sinai and transmitted it to Joshua, right? Does that raise any questions? It should, right? Only to Joshua? Right? I mean, right? We have the Torah reading every Shabbos, assuming we have a minyan, right? And the Magbia lifts up the Torah, says, "B'zot HaTorah asher sa Moshe." This is the Torah which Moses placed lifnei b'nei Yisrael, before the people of Israel, mipi Adonai b'yad Moshe, from the mouth of God to the hand of Moses, right? So, but now it's saying Moses transmitted the Torah to Joshua. So then my question is, only Joshua? Yeah, Alan.
Rabbi, my problem here is you said that this was the oral tradition. And the oral tradition, what is it, 5,200 years until you got to, 4,000 years or whatever before you got to 200 of the Common Era. So when you play the game of gossip, we all know this, and this is why hearsay is inadmissible. Stuff gets lost. You can't really get whether it's credible, and the language here is interesting to me, because the distillation that you always get of universality is seek justice, do justice, be merciful, be generous, whatever word you want. And we get to that later. I read ahead just to be a honor student. And make a fence around the Torah. That really is interesting to me, because often it's translated as walk humbly with your God, or if you're a Hindu or a Buddhist, walk humbly. But the fact is, I'm wondering how much of this is really lost in the translation. How much of this isn't what should have been brought from the very beginning? I don't know if I made that clear.
Yeah, I'm not 100% certain that I understand the question, but I would say, I mean, I think I do well, here's my answer at any rate, okay? The garbling in transmission is not a bug, it's a feature.
Right.
Okay, which is precisely why this material was not supposed to be written down, right? Because once it becomes written down, it becomes codified, and when it becomes codified, it becomes fossilized. Okay, and I mean, look, I mean, there's a right. I mean, in some of these debates, are the same debates that you have in your profession, right? Original intent versus living constitution, right? And it seems to me that by writing stuff down, right, you are prejudiced in favor of original intent. If that can even be determined, but that's a different question, right? But by not writing it down, you have a living constitution, right? And remember, literacy was not universal back then, right? I mean, it's not so simple as like, sending something to the printer or, putting a blog up on the internet, right? I mean, people, even if people were literate, they didn't necessarily have access to reading materials, right? So there was a sort of technological reason why stuff was more oral than what we have either. But I want to focus back to my question when it says he transmitted it to Joshua. And I said, only to Joshua? Isn't it transmitted to the whole people? So therefore, it seems to me if he transmitted it only to Joshua, then Torah here cannot mean the text, right? Because the text was clearly intended, right? I mean, even in the Torah itself, you have the commandment to read the Torah out loud to the whole people, right? So therefore, transmitted it to Joshua, whatever he transmitted to Joshua can't be merely the text, because that was clearly meant to be transmitted to the entire nation, right? So Torah here, and remember that this is professional literature. Torah here means the authority to interpret the Torah authoritatively, right? That's really what it means, right? And that authority resided solely in Moses. And then when Moses was getting ready to die, right, he transmitted it to Joshua. Now Joshua is the holder of the authoritative right to interpret the Torah normatively, right? And then Joshua transmitted it to the elders, and then the elders to the prophets, and the prophets to the Anshe Knesset Hagadolah, the men of the great assembly. Okay, so this is known in rabbinic parlance as Shalshelet HaKabbalah, okay, the chain of tradition, right? And essentially, I mean, all right, and this is a little complicated, right? Rabbinic ordination is called smicha, right? But the actual sort of true smicha died out during this period, during the Roman oppressions. There have been attempts to revive it over the centuries, but the sort of true original smicha had to be from master to disciple, and they had to be in this Shalshelet HaKabbalah, in this chain of tradition, right? Nowadays, I mean, still, for those of us who are rabbis, right, it's important that we receive our ordination from rabbis who received their ordination from rabbis and so on and so on and so forth, going back centuries, right? I mean, are we sure that they are actually in that chain? No, we're not sure, but that's at least the myth, right? So this is the chain of tradition which gives rabbis their authority to be the normative interpreters of the text. Okay. Anshe Knesset Hagadola, right? Is there a word in there that you recognize?
Knesset.
Knesset, right? Right? Which today is the Parliament of Israel, right? I mean, named specifically to stand not in the tradition, but in relation to this term, the Anshe Knesset Hagadola. Knesset means assembly, okay? Lahachnis is to bring together. I mean, Kahal and Knesset, Kehila and Knesset, they're very, very similar. They're different words, obviously, but very similar in meaning. So the men of the Great Assembly, it's not exactly known what this group was, but it's probably, let's say, a proto-Sanhedrin, right? That started during the Persian period when the Persians ruled most of the Middle East, including the land of Israel, and the Jews had like semi-autonomy, and this was the semi-autonomous ruling body. It had 120 members, okay, at least by tradition, which is why the Knesset has 120 members to this day. All right, so that's the men of the Great Assembly. Hem amru shlosha dvarim. They said three things. Okay, now obviously all 120 of them didn't say this, but this is like what they were known for. Okay, havu mitunim bedin, be patient or be moderate in the administration of justice. V'ha'amidu talmidim harbe, raise up many disciples. Va'asu sayag la Torah. Okay, so, right, and I'll get to what that means, a fence around the Torah, but, so don't be hasty, right, when you are administering justice. Be patient, be moderate, and raise up many disciples. Why? I guess the more disciples, first of all, the more likely that this material is going to be preserved in case of persecution. And diffusion of authority, I think, is seen as a good thing. I mean, if you notice, right, we went from, I might call it a unitary executive, right? I mean, Moses was a unitary executive, and then so was Joshua. But then, it gets broader, right? Okay, now, asu sayag le Torah, make a fence around the Torah. Anybody have any idea what that means in the Jewish legal context? All right, I can't. I think I can see everybody, but if you don't necessarily have to. No, I can't. Hi, Sue. Now I can. Yeah, Alan.
I think it probably means protect the Torah or protect the concept of the Torah, and protect the integrity of the Torah so that it can be passed on.
Okay, so and how do we do that?
You teach it patiently. You make sure that people have it and that they have it in the true form, as true form as you can get.
Okay, I mean, all of those are true, but I think it means something else beyond that. Okay, you know, and I guess the fact that you all don't know that shows, to a certain extent, the weakness of conservative Jewish education when it comes to matters of halacha, which is perhaps understandable because, frankly, most conservative Jews don't live their lives according to halacha, right? But in halachic parlance, asu sayag l'Torah means to go above and beyond to make sure that the actual mitzvah of the Torah is not violated. Okay, I'll give you an example, right? And because I know that some of you have kosher homes, right? Some of you have kosher homes. Anybody who has a kosher home has, right? You have fleishig dishes and you have milchig dishes, right? And you don't even have to have a kosher home, because I know a lot of people don't necessarily have them, but they were raised in them, right? Why do we have fleishig and milchig dishes? Why?
You're not supposed to mix the milk of the mother cat, with the meat of the
Right. Exactly. I mean, you're right. The original biblical commandment is lo tivashel gedi b'chelev imo. Do not cook a kid in its mother's milk, right? That's the original mitzvah. Okay. How does chicken parmesan violate that mitzvah?
You have cheese and chicken, and chicken is the meat.
Yes, but do chickens give milk? They don't, right? Chickens don't give, right? They don't, right? So how did we get from do not boil a kid in its mother's milk to no chicken parmesan? And I have to tell you, having grown up in New York in a non-kosher home, that is a great tragedy that we can't eat, although nowadays we have, I don't know, Beyond Chicken and, tofu cheese and whatever. It's not quite the same, but it's, because it's also been a long time. Maybe it's not as good as I think it is, but whatever. Right? You cannot possibly violate that commandment. I mean, you can't violate that commandment, right? I mean, do you have a goat that you milk that you got, right? I mean, but this whole I can't even think of the word I'm looking for. This whole edifice of separation, right? Like separate meat and dairy dishes, right? And separate meat and dairy dish towels, right? And not putting fleishig dishes and milchig dishes in the dishwasher at the same time, and God knows why did I mean, look, I know people who have literally two separate kitchens. All right. How do we get there from do not boil a kid in its mother's milk, right? fence upon fence upon fence, right? That's asu sayag la Torah, fence upon fence upon fence, right? And specifically the question of chicken and dairy is because of this concept called marit ayin, okay, which means the appearance of transgression, right? So that, I don't know, chicken looks enough like meat that we treat it like meat, even though technically it's not actually meat, okay? Fence upon fence upon fence, right? But all of these things I observe, by the way. I mean, I may think that they are, to some extent overkill, to some extent a little bit absurd, but I observe them. But I also will find that, I can do this because I'm a rabbi, right? I know where to find the legitimate leniencies, right? So God forbid I do not eat dairy with poultry, but I do actually, I recall my sins this day. I should say we wash meat and dairy dishes together in the dishwasher, okay? Because Rabbi Ovadia Yosef says you can. If anybody's really interested, I'll explain it later, but right, there are ways that you can justify that, right? But that's fence around the Torah. All right, I'll give one other sort of concrete example of fence around the Torah, and that is again, something that very few of us as conservative Jews are familiar with: the concept of muktzah. Okay, muktzah literally means set aside. Okay, something is muktzah if it has no legitimate usage that is not forbidden on Shabbat, right? So for example, right, everybody knows, right, not allowed to write on Shabbat, right? I'm talking about something that I had to do today for the first time in months, and it feels weird. I actually had to write a check, right? I could not send it by Zelle or PayPal or whatever. I actually physically had to write. I mean, it is so vanishingly rare that I ever write something out by hand, that my handwriting is even less accessible than it used to be, yet less legible, because I don't do it then, right? But, right, that's something you're not allowed to do on Shabbat. Therefore, a pen or a pencil is muktzah, right? What is that? Right? Because what do you do with a pen or a pencil? You write with it, right? That's the only thing it's designed for. The only thing it's designed for. So there are no legitimate usage for a pen or a pencil that are not forbidden on Shabbat. Therefore, we say don't even touch a pen or a pencil on Shabbat. Why? Right? Why do we say it? Right? And I'm actually pretty careful about that, right? If a pen or a pencil is lying somewhere and it's in the way, and I need to move it because I want to put down my coffee cup, I do it in an unusual way because I'm aware of the fact that it's muktzah, right? But what's the point? What's the purpose of this? Yeah, Toby.
So you're not tempted.
Exactly, right?
You're
I
not.
mean, if I'm vigilant about not even touching a writing implement on Shabbat, right, I certainly won't come to write with it, right? I mean, is touching a pencil itself a violation of Shabbat? Not really, not really, right? But it's a fence that preserves, the actual mitzvah. Okay, so that's the first. I promise you, we're not going to spend 45 minutes on each subsequent Mishnah. But like I said, this is foundational. I mean, in some ways, this Mishnah is like it's the foundation on which the whole edifice of rabbinic Judaism rests. Is this chain of transmission? Okay. Any comments or questions on what we've just looked at?
Was raised many disciples meant to be men, I presume? Is that understood?
In its context, for sure.
Talmidim, right? So Talmidot.
Yeah. Well, all right, but look, I mean, all right, the question of Talmidim versus Talmidot, I mean, that's a different issue, right? I mean, and what's interesting is that, and I'm starting to be like more conscious of this, because languages are living things, right? And so the Rabbinical Assembly has a program where they matched up. I mean, it's totally voluntary, but I decided to participate in it this year during the month of Mar Cheshvan, which is the month we're in now. Once a week, you get together with another rabbi who they assign you to study some material that they send out for us. All right, I mean, legal material. And, so when you were signing up for it, they said, what languages? And I said, I'm comfortable in either Hebrew or in either English or Hebrew, which I am. And they assigned me to an Israeli woman rabbi. And so we are conducting our conversations in Hebrew, and I've become acutely aware that my spoken Hebrew is kind of fossilized as the language existed about 40 years ago, right? Because why do I say that? Because you raised the question of Talmidim as opposed to Talmidot, right? I mean, the normative rules of grammar say that if you have a mixed group, it takes the masculine plural, right? So that Talmidim does not necessarily, by the normative rules of Hebrew grammar, only mean male students, right? If you had a mixed group, but even if you had 20 female students and one male student, it's Talmidim, right? And there's an awareness that language shapes the way we think, right? So in Israel, they're experimenting with all different new forms or different forms or whatever, or, being very careful to say like Talmidim v'Talmidot, or even better, Talmidot v'Talmidim, right? But even like new forms like Talmidim ot or Talmidot im, right? Which like is, to me, I mean, because I'm a little bit of a grammar nerd for complicated personal reasons, drives me right up the wall, right? But like I said, language is a living thing, and my language is fossilized at about not quite 40 years ago, 35 years ago, really. So I'm like more aware of that, right? So yes, I mean, they certainly meant only men. I mean, if some of you have read a little bit further ahead, right, we're going to eventually get to some stuff that is incredibly misogynistic, okay? Just because I am teaching it does not mean I endorse it, right? But it's in there, so I'm not going to say, oh, just skip that part. But it is incredibly misogynistic, which is it, right? So that people can have many good qualities and still have some bad qualities too, right? But certainly in their context, yes, they meant men. But that doesn't mean that we have to understand it as, as only men. I mean, I have, one of the things, frankly, that I am most proud of as I look back on my career is the number of people who were my students who are now rabbis. Now, some of that is a little bit of cheating because I did teach in a rabbinical seminary. But, and there are, I mean, I have, women rabbis who had been my students when I was their Hillel director. And I have male rabbis who have been my students when I was the Hillel director. And to me, that's irrelevant. But yes, in the original context, they certainly meant men. Anything else? All right, so we'll go maybe one more Mishnah. This is pretty famous. In fact, you can find it on the wall of our sanctuary, right? Shimon Hatzadik Haya Mishayarei Knesset Hagdolah. Shimon the righteous was one of the last members of the Great Assembly, right? So he was, I guess, at the tail end of the men of the Great Assembly. And then when the men of the Great Assembly, when that body ceased to exist, he would continue to teach. Hu haya omer, he used to say, Al shlosha dvarim ha'olam omed. The world rests on three things, or the world stands on three things, stands upon three things. Al HaTorah, right? The Torah, Va'al Ha'avodah, worship, Va'al Gemilut Chasadim, acts of loving kindness, right? And what's interesting, what we have done is we have retranslated this to conform with more like contemporary practice, right? Al HaTorah, on the Torah, we understand that to mean what? Torah study. The Al HaAvodah, right? We translate that generally, if you see, I mean, and Dr. Culp's translation is a more literal one. If, in a modern context, we translate this as worship, right? Avodah certainly meant, and when Shimon HaTzadik was alive, the temple still stood, right? And just like we have the Avodah, right, on Yom Kippur, right, that the service of the Kohen Gadol, Avodah originally meant the temple service, right? But we don't have that anymore, right? Is that pillar of the world no longer applicable? No, it means prayer, right? Worship. The Al Gemilut Hasadim, acts of right? He translates acts of piety. Far be it from me to say he's wrong, but I think because Hasadim, yes, means acts of piety, right? But Hesed also means, and I think, and actually, I mean, Nelson Glick, who was a great American rabbi and archaeologist, on whom Indiana Jones is partly based actually on Nelson Glick, if you want to know, which actually makes sense because Steven Spielberg grew up in Cincinnati and Nelson Glick was the president of HUC when it was only in Cincinnati. Although, anyway, he wrote his PhD thesis on the meaning of the word chesed in the Bible. So it has a lot of different meanings, right? But we talk Gemilut Hasadim, acts of loving kindness. Okay. I have a tendency to push past our 1 hour limit. As a fence around the Torah, I'm not going to do that tonight. But again, if there are any questions or comments on what, either the first Mishnah or the second Mishnah, please go ahead.
So again, we've taken Hasidim and reconfigured it to mean acts of loving kindness, as opposed to, but the original meaning is piety.
I'm not sure, actually. I'm actually not sure, okay? Because, right, Chesed, Chesed is a complicated word, right? I mean, that phrase, only to do justice and love mercy and walk humbly with your God, asot mishpat, to do justly, va'ahavat chesed, it's the same word, to love chesed, right? So chesed can mean mercy, but in its original, like in its Torah-itic context, I think chesed, my teacher in undergraduate school translated chesed as covenant faithfulness, right? Faithful, right? You're faithful to the covenant, okay? An actual not bad translation for the word chesed would be grace, okay? But we don't ever want to use the word grace because that's awfully Christian sounding, right? And a lot of what we do as Jews, particularly, but not only American Jews, is we don't want to look too Christian, right? So I'm not sure that, but what is acts of piety, right? What does piety really mean, right? We tend to think of, at least maybe I do, pious as more like observant of ritual, right? But if by acts of piety you mean, faithfulness to the covenant, which certainly includes things way beyond just ritual, then it's not a bad translation, right? But to me, certainly, right, when we think of Gemilut Chasadim, that's interpersonal, right? It's person to person. It's not,
yes.
It's not Ben Adam Labakom. It's not between human beings and God, right? It's Ben Adam La Adam, between human beings and other human beings, right? So again, I mean, I'm using, I mean, one of the nice things about Safari, if you're not already familiar with it, is that where there are various translations, particularly if they're either in the public domain or Safari has gotten permission to use them, you can choose which translation to use. And I was looking, and I have to say, Dr. Culp's translation, and I don't know him, although it's surprising that I don't know him because he teaches Talmud at the conservative yeshiva in Jerusalem. So we have 10 million like mutual friends or acquaintances, but I don't actually know him. But like I looked at the others, and this says Joshua, not Yehoshua, which is the way we speak, right? So Culp's translation is kind of the least quirky, I think, which doesn't mean that I agree with it 100%, but I probably agree with it 95%. But so that's the one I chose, but feel free, particularly, I mean, if you don't have your own account on Safari, it's free, although you will get fundraising emails, which is fine because you should donate to them because it is an incredible resource. But you should have your own account. It'll save, you'll log in and it will give you, where the last X number of places you've been, and it's just an incredible resource. Anyway, all right. If there's no more questions, then thank you for sharing, and we will go on with more Pirkei Avot next week, unless, I don't know, some, God forbid, some earth-shaking event occurs that I feel need to, be addressed. But, I mean, certainly, I mean, we should just all pray for a massive fireball to strike the earth, frankly. I mean, but I'm going to stop the recording at this time. I mean,